Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our second iteration of CME Palooza and our very first CME Palooza Fall. We're really excited about the lineup that we have scheduled. As my phone goes off, of course, right? As we start, CME Palooza never fails. So I'm Derek Warnick. I'm one of our co-coordinators for CME Palooza. I'm joined by Scott Kober, the other co-coordinator. I don't want to take a whole lot of time. I'm going to give most of our time to our panels, so I have a few introductory slides to go through. Scott, do you have anything you want to add before I get started with those?
Nothing.
Great. Then let us switch over to the slide. So this is our first panel, the future of CME. What will CME, CPD look like in 5 to 10 years? With our moderator, Lawrence Sherman, who I'll introduce in 1 second. Real quick one to just acknowledge our sponsors, who we're extremely thankful for. Our gold sponsor, Genentech. Silver sponsors, iMedix, MedPage Today. Our bronze sponsors, CMEology, Educational Measures, Highmark CE, Impact Education, MedEdicus, Red MedEd, and Vivacity Consulting. There are 3 ways that you can ask questions, and we really encourage you to ask as many questions as you want. We'd like to have some audience interaction. So the 3 ways that you can do it are you can use the MedPage Today text line to send in a question, 267-666-0CME. You can also click on the Google Q&A link, which is located at the bottom of each video. You do need to have a Google Plus account to use this, but it's fairly easy to use. And you can also tweet your question using the CME Palooza hashtag. Scott and I will be monitoring the questions, and we will throw them out to the panels at an appropriate time. Speaker disclosure, just keep in mind that all opinions, discussions, and/or conclusions that are expressed are our own or the panels. They do not represent an endorsement by or a position of our employers, parent company, or affiliates. And this is our panel for today, who I will let Lawrence introduce real quick. So Lawrence Sherman is our moderator today. Lawrence is the Senior Vice President of Educational Strategy at Prova Education. He is a global medical education futurist, social media and medicine enthusiast, TEDx speaker, Future Med faculty, author, dad, comedian, runner, native Brooklynite, and much to my chagrin, diehard Mets fan. Oh. Lawrence, take it away.
Thank you, Derek. And just to let everybody know, I didn't send a bio in to Derek, so he just pulled that off my Twitter page. So, Derek, thank you for doing your due diligence.
Of course.
I am not going to introduce the panelists. I'm going to let them introduce themselves because I don't like reading long bios like you just did. I prefer to let people share what they want to share about themselves. But I did want to give a few opening comments. First of all, Derek and Scott, thank you very much for inviting us to talk about the future of CME. But I will tell you that we're not going to talk about the future of CME because CME, in my opinion, is the wrong thing to call it. Whether we call it continuous healthcare education, continuous healthcare education team-based learning, continuous professional development for healthcare professionals, I think we have to be broader than just medicine. The other thing is I hope that we're going to touch on things that go beyond just industry-supported medical education and continuing medical education because there's a whole lot of good things that are happening that are outside of the industry-supported world, and I think a lot of what we often get lost in is what's within that world. So I'm hoping that we're going to talk about that. The last thing I hope comes out, and I tweeted about this morning, and I really hope that we have some participation, is there's a key stakeholder that's often omitted from CHE, CME, IPE, and that's the patient. And I hope that we bring the patient perspective in this through Twitter, through questions, or in the future consider adding patients to a panel like this so that we have that perspective because I think they are the key stakeholder to ensure that medical education is successful. So with that, I'd like to just say my panelists in order of presentation will be Kathy Chappell, Eugene Posniak, and Brian Vardabedian. And I hope that many of you have never heard of these people. And the reason I say that is we also get lost in listening to the same people over and over again, like me. That's why this panel is about the panelists and not about what I have to say, and I'll be shutting up in 30 seconds, and the panelists will be giving presentations, interacting with each other, and interacting with you. Our perspective was to bring in interprofessional education, global education, and the practitioner, and that's why this panel was put together. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathy, and Kathy, remember, you have to speak slowly and clearly, and while Kathy is the only one who doesn't have her title underneath her, there was a small IT challenge, and despite Reggie running in to try to help, Kathy has nothing below her picture but her picture. Kathy, it's your show.
Well, thank you for that introduction and my pointing out my competency problems and being able to use Google Hangout appropriately. But thanks for inviting me. I'm Kathy Chappell. I'm the Vice President for Accreditation and Research for the American Nurses Credentialing Center. And I'm just going to be starting out my introduction, be talking about interprofessional education, just giving an overview of what IPE is, and making sure that we have a common understanding of IPE. So I'm going to start out with the definition, and the definition that's used most often in the literature is from the World Health Organization. And WHO defines IPE as when students from 2 or more professions learn from, with, and about each other to enable effective collaboration and to improve health outcomes. And in the continuing education arena, we can replace student with learner or healthcare professional, as Lawrence said. You know, that definition should span from academia into the practice setting. But the hallmark of the definition of IPE is really interactivity. So in the planning process, healthcare educators should be interacting together and learning from, with, and about each other in the planning process of an IPE activity. And within that activity, learners should have the opportunity to learn from, with, and about each other. And to Lawrence's point, that includes incorporating patients and patients' families whenever possible. Sometimes the term IPE is used synonymously with interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, but those are really different terms. So a discipline would be more like a specialty within a profession. So internal medicine or surgery or pediatrics are disciplines within the profession of medicine or within the profession of nursing. So when people use that term synonymously, interdisciplinary with interprofessional, they could be referring to just physicians, just surgeons and internal medicine doctors and pediatricians interacting, but not really the concept of interprofessional education. And multidisciplinary, again, just multiple disciplines within the same profession interacting in the educational space, but not between professions. So why all the recent focus on IPE? Well, IPE is really a strategy to improve interprofessional collaborative practice or skills or performance of the healthcare team or members of the team, or to improve patient outcomes. And by increasing skills like communication and collaboration, we can really positively impact outcomes. And I think one of the biggest pieces of evidence comes from the Joint Commission. So year after year, the Joint Commission looks at the root causes of sentinel events, and over and over and over again. It's failures in communication that sit in the top 3 causes, root causes of sentinel events. So by impacting or improving the communication between team members, we have a real opportunity to decrease the number of sentinel events that are occurring. Planning IPE activities, though, is going to require that healthcare educators develop different skill sets or at least expand the skill sets that they currently have. So a healthcare professional educator with an interprofessional audience is going to need really good group facilitation skills. And they may also need some conflict management skills. They're also going to have to learn how to plan activities that account for the different scopes of practice. So when you have an interprofessional audience and you have physicians and nurses and pharmacists, you're going to have to develop content that's appropriate to meet the learning needs of all those different professions. And what's often missed and is critical in IPE is to be able to manage the cultures and the hierarchies that currently exist between those professions. But IPE also gives us an opportunity, and this is really prevalent in the literature, to increase understanding between different professions when providing patient care. And multiple studies in the literature have demonstrated that learners participating in IPE activities report an increased understanding and appreciation of the other professions. The problem is when those, after that IPE activity is over, and those individuals go back into the practice setting, they go back into siloed care, and they don't have good role models for interprofessional collaboration. And that's where I think really CE can make a huge difference. IPE also gives us an opportunity to increase efficiency and save costs. So when you're developing content for an interprofessional audience and you're able to meet the learning needs of physicians and nurses and pharmacists, you have an opportunity to decrease documentation, and you have an opportunity to spread the workload over that interprofessional planning team. In the literature, certainly improving safety and improving patient outcomes, and then the opportunity to address patient care or patient issues in a more holistic manner is an opportunity with IPE. And on a purely practical note, if you can increase participation in your educational activities, you have an opportunity to, as a company, increase your revenue. So the last thing I want to go over really is the evidence for IPE, and two particular areas or organizations that I'd like to highlight. The first is the National Center for Interprofessional Practice and Education, and that's located in Minnesota, and it's a public-private partnership that's collecting data all across the country on IPE. And they're looking at really what they call the nexus, the intersection between practice and education. So they've funded demonstration sites, or what they call incubator sites, all across the country. And they're collecting data on different types of educational interventions to improve collaborative practice and patient outcomes. And all these sites are funneling data into this huge national database, and it will be analyzed to look at things like what strategies are more effective than others, or are there strategies that work in the ICU that don't work on the floor? Are there strategies that work in rural settings that don't work in urban settings? So we'll have a huge database, and they'll start publishing out of the National Center probably within the next year. And the last thing I want to mention is the Joint Accreditation Program. So the ACCME, ACPE, and ANCC developed a collaborative credentialing program to credential organizations that provide interprofessional education. And we look at what the outcomes that our jointly accredited providers have been capable of doing. And I'd just like to highlight a couple. One of the first organizations that was accredited when they applied, about 30% of their educational activities were interprofessional. But within the next year or two, over 85% of their activities were interprofessional. So a huge increase as they saw the value of IPE. And then from a patient outcome standpoint, organizations have demonstrated outcomes like reducing waiting times, reducing ICU costs, and reducing hospitalizations for certain categories of patients. So really positive outcomes as these organizations have pursued interprofessional education in a very assertive manner, I guess. So I guess I'll stop now. I just wanted to give you an overview of IPE and the positive impact that it can have, and I will turn it back over to Lawrence.
Well, thanks, Kath. And I want you to think about 3 specific points related to IPE that we'll see in the next 5 to 10 years, sort of the theme of the panel. So after the rest of our guys give their talks, I want to come back and I want each of us to think about, from our own perspectives, what do we expect to see? Right, so it could be what percentage of continuing education in healthcare do you think will be truly IPE? What percentage of currently singly accredited providers do you think will be jointly accredited? Like that, okay?
Okay.
But while you're thinking about those fun facts, I'd like to ask my good friend Eugene Pozniak to jump in here and talk a little bit about the future of European CME, and I know you and I sort of do stuff beyond Europe. Let's see what the future of globalization, crossing borders with best practices might well be.
Cool, great. Thank you, Lawrence. Yeah, so as Lawrence said, I work as a provider as well. So you've got two jobs underneath here. There's CME Learning, which is one hat that I wear as a European-based provider of CME education in Europe, and whether it's globally, and also as European CME Forum, which is a not-for-profit organization where we get together stakeholders who are interested in discussing anything to do with CME in Europe. And with these two sides, really, we have an exposure to what's actually going on in the CME market. And what I'd like to do, Lawrence, to start off with, is maybe go back a few years and even to the beginning of CME in Europe, because that can sort of paint a picture of the journey that we've taken to get to where we are now, and from that sort of try and map out what's happening in the future. So the formal CME structure in Europe started around 1999, 2000. A few of the medical societies started accrediting education. We saw that UEMS, the European Union of Medical Specialists, had set up a CME system themselves. So now we know it as the UEMS EAC CME accreditation body. And individual countries as well started to implement their own accreditation systems. So from that, sort of the first 5-year timescale, from about 2000 to 2005, we saw these three systems coming to maturity. The national accreditation systems through the European specialty accreditation boards, and also the system, the UEMS EAC CME system. And a few of the early adopters got involved in this, and things were sort of just bubbled along quite quietly. About in the middle of that decade, 2005, a lot of people started looking at this, and I have to say that I think that there were quite a few companies involved that got involved in it, and it's a phrase that I've heard from our US cousins sometimes using, where it could be seen as, you know, CME could be seen as a safe haven for off-label discussion, this kind of thing, and quite a few non-ideal practices were taking place around that time, but CME did grow in Europe. It did evolve, it did expand, it got more people involved, more countries were looking at their own systems, and with this growth, I think once we hit the sort of the 2010 mark, the external influences started coming in. We started seeing, and you know, in the past 5 years now, the immediate past, we've seen, you know, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which we do feel in Europe as well. We have a similar kind of thing called the Bribery Act in the UK. The European law is coming out now, where people are looking at how the money flows around certain projects, how people are paid, and this applies in the medical education sector as well. And more recently, of course, the Sunshine Act, and what FPA are launching now as well, or over the next couple of years, with the responsible transparency, with the public disclosure of payments to physicians. We're seeing this in Europe, and the different stakeholders are evaluating the environment and coming up with ways to actually incorporate it within the CME field. So over this, it's only 14, 15 years, we've got this system that just started off as a nice thing to do, a good thing to do, and it has become embedded as part of revalidation, relicensing as well. And it does get, CME does get interpreted in different ways across the different countries. What we have been hoping for is some kind of pan-European federal system of CME accreditation, of CME standards. But as the years have progressed, I think we're not getting any closer to that. And one of the challenges that Europe faces is that it is still a couple of dozen individual countries with a couple of dozen different languages, with a couple of dozen different styles of healthcare provision. And it seems that it's really difficult to actually come up with a minimum standard that is that can be applied across different healthcare systems and different countries. And even though we have different groups who've actually tried to do this, it looks as though the way CME will evolve will be through a national approach, or certainly through the specialties themselves. The European medical societies, some of the larger ones, do set curricula for learning in the continuing education sphere, and including their own systems as well. They run a kind of recertification program. So we'll see this carrying on. But as far as the pan-European solution for, where one size fits all, one central place to go for accreditation across all professions as well, I think that's an ask that's a bit too far. I don't think we'll go that far. We will see, however, more cross-border recognition, I think, of different credits, and a lot more discussion as well.
Are you finished?
So, I think so, yeah. Have I covered off everything? You sent me that note earlier, Lawrence, to say talk about these things.
Well,
what did I miss?
The affect was so flat. I didn't know you were finished. You didn't give us some big finish. It was very British.
Feel like
Yes,
wow.
I'm sorry about that, but actually looking at this, I am feeling a little bit flat, because we were expecting this da-da to happen, where suddenly we have this one system. Actually, just recently, over this past year, we've been looking into what kind of mandate would it take for a pan-European system to work, to operate. And the European Commission, the civil service attached to the European Union, the guys who make all the rules and things, they've turned around recently and said, we're not going to look at a pan-European system quite yet. Let's support the national systems that are going. Let's make sure they operate. Let's make sure that there's a recognition of credits across borders, but they're not prepared to go much further than that. So it wasn't intentional. I'm sorry that it ended with a bit of a whimper rather than a bang.
It's okay. We've come to expect that.
Yeah. Hold on one second.
Good.
Oh, good. So, Kathy, just so you know, we already have 3 questions in the queue for you, but I'd like to go to Brian Vardabedian, because I know Brian has a hard stop a little before us. I guess you have clinic today, Brian. And I want to make sure that you not only get to give your presentation, but also if there are any questions, we can get to them first. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Brian Vardabedian, who is known as @Dr_V on Twitter, and who has a really interesting blog. And if you guys have not read it, Brian, I hope that you plug your blog. Boy, that sounded terrible.
Thank you very much. I'm broadcasting live from the Texas Children's Health Center in the Woodlands, and so at 45 after the hour, there are going to be little kids running behind me, so bear with me. But thank you very much for having me along this morning. I am a pediatrician at Texas Children's Hospital, Baylor College of Medicine. I'm kind of interesting in respect that I don't consider myself an educator, but I've been pulled into medical education at Baylor College of Medicine over the past couple of years, teaching digital literacy and developing a curriculum with our undergraduate medical education office. I'm also developing a MOOC in collaboration with Rice University, which will be launched in the spring. And so it's trial by fire for me for education, but I really appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning. Last night was with a bunch of pediatricians at dinner, and I said in the morning I'm going to be on a conference chat with some CME professionals. And they said, there are actually people that sit around and talk about CME? And I said, yeah. So it's exciting to contribute my little bit here. I think I'll be brief here, but I think this is a really exciting time to be in medicine, and this really should be an exciting time for you as CME professionals. I think we're really witnessing a period of unprecedented change in medicine. Knowledge and technology and everything is changing at a rate much faster than we can even keep up with, which represents a huge opportunity for professionals in continuing medical education. As David Weinberger from the Harvard Berkman Center has suggested, we're experiencing a crisis of knowledge, and again, this rate of change is really unprecedented, and I think some things are going to come from that escalation of knowledge. We're seeing that doctors, by definition, have to partner with their patients. With respect to knowledge, we're moving from, in medical school, actually memorizing everything that needs to be learned to actually accessing knowledge. And I think we're going to see probably doctors narrowing their scope of specialty given the this escalation of knowledge and information that we see happening. Yeah, I think as part of this, there's going to be a renaissance in CME, and I think that we're probably going to see physicians make a step from CME as sort of a nagging requirement to CME as something that is a critical element of survival in a new environment. I don't think it's going to be sustainable to glide along upon what you learned in 2 years of preclinical education. So there's some challenges, I think, that you guys are going to face when dealing with someone like me. I've learned working with undergraduates that learners learn very differently now, and just yesterday I was in an auditorium with 180 undergraduate medical students, and we do everything with small group learning, and to keep them engaged is really a huge challenge, and I think in the new attention economy, keeping the attention of physicians for continuing medical education is going to represent a huge challenge. We're also consuming information in chunks and much smaller bits of information. One of the challenges we face too is not knowing what doctors are going to do in the future. When we're preparing our curriculum for even undergraduate medical education, we can't predict what physicians are going to be doing even 10 years from now. And also, you know, CME, I was thinking about this on the way in, that CME really has an image problem, and Lawrence really touched upon this, that CME may be the wrong term. When we talk about CME with physicians, it's like eat your broccoli, you know, you've got to go, it's this requirement, and I think we have to change the way that we maybe deliver CME or present it to doctors, and physicians, of course, are going to have to change their mindset and culture surrounding continuing education, because it's going to be such a critical element going forward, given this escalation in knowledge that's coming down on us. So those are just some insights, and I look forward to some questions and dialogue.
Yeah, Brian, thank you for that. And I'm going to start it off by sort of addressing something you said. You know, one of the things that we've begun doing a lot is trying to really better understand our learners rather than trying to do the things that we've always done, because that's
Right.
what's expected of us. And it's really interesting. I mean, Eugene can sort of comment on this from the European perspective, but we've been doing panels of learners, like lunch with the learners, bringing in healthcare professionals that aren't involved in medical education and asking them and letting medical educators talk to them. Now, I think what's really important is what you said, which is the learners are learning differently, there's different expectations, but even the last generation of learners have expectations that we may be missing. And so how can medical educators better learn about the preferences and needs of those in practice, the hundreds of thousands, or if you look globally, the millions of practicing healthcare professionals that need this continuing education?
So, Lawrence? What exactly are you asking specifically? Or what?
I don't know. That was a big question.
Yeah, that was a big question.
How can we learn about? How can we get inside the heads of you and your colleagues?
Yeah, and maybe make it less like broccoli.
Yeah. Like, how do we reposition CME? Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. I'd have to think about that. I don't know if I have a good answer for you. You know, I guess I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that, Lawrence. I'm sorry.
Well, that's our struggle, Brian, right?
Yeah.
So that's the thing. You know, you have your expectation, your students have their expectation. I'll leave it to you to think about, but that may be a great blog post in
Right.
follow-up if you can think about that. Panelists, do you guys have any questions for Brian before he has to scoot off?
I had one question. I think in the context of IPE and teams and incorporating social media, how could that change what the team looks like? Because to me, that team then could be, I mean, there's essentially no border, right? I mean, you don't have to be in a geographic location then to have a team that could actually really impact practice.
When you talk about a team, what do you mean? Maybe this is sort of a technical thing that I don't understand.
So if you had a healthcare team where the physician was in one country, but the nurse taking care of the patient was in a different country, but they could still be a virtual team in caring for that particular patient.
So the question is, how would that work, or
how does, I guess, social media, how do you see that playing out in that space? The advantages and disadvantages, maybe.
Well, the challenge with public social media and public platforms, of course, is the issue of patient disclosure. So when it comes down to discussing, any issue related to any patient-specific case, that's really kind of off limits in terms of public platforms. And in terms of collaborative platforms that are closed, there are so many different platforms that people operate on that present some real challenges. Kind of the, when I look at Twitter, just my use of Twitter, it's really evolved as a personal learning network for me in terms of the people that I've collected and the people that I've chosen to follow. It's really represented a huge change for me in terms of how I gather information and how I collect information. But in terms of patient-specific cases, that's a real challenge, and it's one that we really can't handle in the public realm.
I totally agree with you in the public realm, but I also think there's potential opportunities in technology maybe to be developed or to be refined that will enable those teams to collaborate across borders in ways that we haven't done before.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, Kath and Brian, I think that there's two parts to that question, right? So, Brian, I think from a learning and an educational perspective, I think there are no borders, and I think that the opportunity to learn as teams and as colleagues and as non-location specific people, those opportunities are growing, and social media plays an incredibly important role, including involving the patient. I'll get back to that point I brought up before. And Kathy, I couldn't agree more. There are things going on now with Google Glass, wearable technology, and other platforms that are just now starting to touch the surface of global collaborative care of patients. But to Brian's point, there's no set protocol or process yet, so we have to be wary of local and international privacy and other concerns.
I totally agree. It'll be interesting, though, to see as technology evolves how that team concept may change over time.
Yeah, and Brian, I just wanted to make sure that you make a little shout out and smile. We know that there are going to be a whole group of people from Texas watching this in the archive. Yeah. I think either you want to give them a yeehaw or a howdy.
I'm not going to do that, but it is good. It's great to be here in the great state of Texas, and hello to everybody who's tuning. I guess there's some folks from the Texas Medical Association who are tuning in, so welcome.
Excellent. So, Eugene or Kathy, do you, or Derek or Scott, do you have any other questions for Brian before we sort of move on to some of the other questions that have come in?
Yeah, actually, there was a question that was tweeted in. Someone was asking for Brian. Do you see an increasing role for CME in light of resident training hour limits?
Of course, but. I don't think the challenge comes with resident education. I mean, I don't think the challenge of CME is really in the GME, point of view. I think it's when folks are 5-10 years out. How are we approaching these doctors who really believe that what they know is all they need to know, and so there really needs to be this cultural change in terms of helping doctors understand that they need to be, that the world is really changing around them. So in terms of resident resident hours. I'm not sure that's directly going to relate to CME. I'm curious about this idea of reshaping and rebranding CME. I mean, I don't have a good solution for it, but I just wonder from the panel how you guys are professionals in this regard. I mean, how do we reshape this? Or Lawrence, maybe you have ideas. How do we reshape this idea of CME to make it more appealing, at least on the surface?
Yeah, I'll give you my thoughts, and then I'm hoping Huge and Kathy and Derek, you can jump in as well. I think that we have to stop doing things for the sake of doing them because that's the way we've always done them. We have to stop assuming that everybody who has knowledge on a subject is able to teach it, and we have to really be teaching our teachers how to teach so that they're meeting the needs of our students. Because I'm sure you've seen this 1,000 times, Brian. You go to something, you go to a CME activity, and the topic is of great interest to you. You have hundreds or thousands of patients with a certain condition, and you have questions. You're self-directed to go there, and then somebody gives a 1-hour lecture on what they think is important to you, and it never touches upon what it is that was important to you, and you can't get that hour back. Or someone has the information that you want, and they don't know how to engage, and they don't know how to teach, and I think we need to do a better job of teaching the teachers how to teach so that they teach the learners how they want to learn. That's why I asked the question that I asked of you before. And we have to embrace the technology and platforms and not try to make things fit. So don't try to do everything that's an hour long on the internet. No offense, Derek, but sometimes 15-minute snippets or 10-minute snippets or a quick video interview is a better learning environment than a 1-hour complicated click here, do this kind of CME activity, because your need is only one small part of it. So that's my thought on that, Brian. But Eugene, Kathy, what do you think?
Actually, I'd like to ask a related sort of question, because there are all these different types of learning styles that we're talking about. Right at the beginning, Lawrence, you're talking about CME and then talking about different definitions of this terminology. But I'd like to know, I'd like to ask you, Brian, what would you say would be the percentage of all the education that you interact with in a typical week? What percentage would that be what we would term sort of traditional CME? That you would actually engage with some education and it's certifiable, you can get a certificate from the end of it?
Yeah, I'd say a very small amount. A lot of my education is kind of this ambient acquisition of knowledge that I get from reading things that are filtered through my human signal on Twitter. Medscape is kind of interesting because I can earn CME hours in quarter-hour units, so I can read a very quick review and which is kind of the way I read information and get credit for it. So, with the exception of that, I would say a very small percentage of what I do is formal CME education.
And Eugene, it becomes a challenge when the accreditation authority won't recognize quarter-hour credits.
Sure. Yeah, and everything that you were just talking about with, teaching the teachers how to teach. I think this is now outside of the scope of traditional CME, so we need to rethink a whole host of things to encompass all kind of educational intervention with learners.
Anybody else have anything for Brian?
I'm still here. I've got another 10 minutes here, so I'm good.
Oh, okay. Well, you may want to comment on some of the questions that are coming in. So, Kathy, there's a boatload of questions coming in for you.
All right.
If that boat were made of paper and floating about that big. But we have questions. So, our friend Daniel Guiney asks, how do we entice the various team members to partake in IPE? It seems like nurses and pharmacists come, but not physicians.
Well, I think that goes back to really understanding the learner and demonstrating why participation in that activity, assuming it's an IPE activity, what's the benefit to the patient, what potentially is the benefit to the organization, what's the benefit to those individual team members. And I think if you're not articulating that, then you can potentially lose a piece of the target audience that should be there to address whatever the issue is that you're trying to address.
Brian, do you have a thought on that?
You know, I guess it gets to the core question of why do doctors want to come and participate in any of these events at all. And I mean, there has to be a very clear value proposition for the doctor. There has to be something there that they don't understand or something that they really absolutely need to know. It's kind of like bringing doctors to social media. Unless you can prove some value for them, they're just not going to be there. And I think that to date, a lot of the educational offerings just have not created that value that really puts a doc any further ahead. And yeah, again, we need to make this leap from continuing medical education as sort of a requirement to continuing medical education as sort of a critical element of you know, professional engagement or something that they absolutely have to do. So I think that's the challenge, is finding things that are of real value to physicians.
Yeah.
Well, and I think also in terms of the healthcare environment and pay for performance and physician compensation being dependent on patient outcomes, and that will, you know, for the foreseeable future is there. When the patient does better, the team benefits, and the physician benefits, and the organization benefits.
I think that's right. I think, you know, my thought on this is also not everything warrants interprofessional education.
Absolutely.
Right? So it goes to the topic, it goes to the identified needs, it goes to the patient type. If the journey of a patient with a certain condition means that they will interact with these various healthcare professionals, then, and the need exists in handoff, communication, whatever, and it's articulated to those potential learners that way, I think you have more of a chance of them participating. That's what I've seen practically. But I think if we just try to do it for the sake of doing it, and I mean no disrespect, I think we're going to fail, right? So getting joint accreditation is great so that you can apply the appropriate 2 or 3 or 4 if you expand it to the right educational activities where those particular needs exist. What we don't want to do is try to make everything fit, so to say, well, everything we did was interprofessional, and then only 1 nurse participated, or 17 nurses and 1 physician, or something like that.
Right. The activity has to be driven on the need. So if the problem in practice requires different members of the team, then that's who should be participating, or that's how that educational activity should be developed. But if the issue is solely a medical physician issue or solely a nursing issue, there's nothing wrong with doing that also.
Exactly. We have another IPE question. Huge, did you want to jump in on that one?
Actually, I was just wondering, in practice, in day-to-day reality, which party is it that initiates an IPE activity?
Which party is in profession?
Yeah, which corner of the ring? So say, why don't we put together an IPE program to address a specific situation? Does it come from the nurses, the pharmacists?
Well, I think, again, it's predicated on what the problem in practice you're trying to address and who potentially is leading that initiative. So it could come from a physician, it could come from a nurse, it could come from a pharmacist, it could come from an educator, it could come from an administrator. I mean, I think it's all dependent on what the problem is at the end of the day that you're trying to address.
And strong providers will have established collaborations, huge, so they'll probably do it together. And some providers are jointly accredited or multiply accredited, so that they're looking at the problems across the team rather than at individual members of the team. I'm trying to get to more questions here. So our friend Erin Schwartz asks, are parallel educational events, so same topic but divided by profession, less effective than IPE activities that are incorporated together?
So I think the evidence base is we're still learning. We're still learning when is it better to put the team together and deliver content that's appropriate to have everybody in the room. I mean, again, that's the hallmark of interprofessional education, is the opportunity for learners to learn from, with, and about each other in the space of the educational activity. Then there may be times when it's worth breaking out those individual professions to focus on profession-specific issues. So that's still evolving. We're still learning what those best practices are. That's why I highlighted that National Center for Interprofessional Education, Practice and Education, because I think that's where the evidence, we're going to get a lot of data out of that particular public-private partnership.
Hey, Lawrence, can I just throw in the issue of the patient here?
Absolutely.
Because that's one of the key questions that's come up at our medical meetings, and this came up at Stanford Medicine X very recently. There's a strong push to involve patients in medical meetings, the patient voice.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard you mention at the beginning, Lawrence, how important it is to have the patient voice with continuing education. I wonder where the patient voice would fit in, because I think there is, in medical meetings, there's a clear time and place for patient voice. I think there's a time when it's really just sort of window dressing and it doesn't add anything. So I don't know, Kathy, or Lawrence, where would the patient voice fit in here?
Well, I'll just say for Loris, do you want to?
No, go ahead, Kathy.
I just did a workshop on incorporating on IPE, and I put together groups of 6 and said that they were in an interprofessional planning team. So we had a physician, we had a nurse, we had a student nurse, we had a social worker, we had a patient who was a 13-year-old girl, and we had the patient's mother. And so we had a problem, and they had to identify what the problem in practice was, and then start developing an IPE activity. And after I brought it to a close, I asked each group, who had the biggest voice in your group? And every single group, it was the patient who had the most influence over the planning process. But every single group, and this is what surprised me, every single group identified the problem in practice as being the patient non-compliant. Nobody self-reflected on maybe it was the way we were communicating with the patient, maybe it was the way we were interacting with the patient. They all 6 groups defaulted in, well, if the patient were just compliant, we wouldn't have this problem. And those are educators. So I think, that was just a aha moment on
Wow.
the importance of putting a patient on the team and listening to the team. And every patient in those 6 groups kept saying, you're not listening to me. You're not hearing what I'm saying. And the healthcare providers are going, well, because you're non-compliant. So there's a lot of, I think, real drill down with healthcare educators in those planning teams on how should we be listening to patients, and what responsibility do we have in that space.
And Brian, there's a couple of different time points along the medical education continuum where patients can play a vital role. Providers that are really interested in following up on patient-level gaps and barriers that they find can reach out to patients and do surveys, work with patient organizations. There's no shortage of them who have access to patients. The problem is a lot of those organizations have the very active patient advocates and don't have the down and dirty, in the trenches level patients that have the gaps that have been identified. So providers have to be a little savvy about going out and getting that information, like asking potential learners to ask their patients about what issues are and sharing that with providers. The other place is, and you have to be a little gutsy to do this, is actually letting a patient present to a professional audience. Now, I've done that in the past, and I've had mixed results. If you use the right kind of patient who knows how to speak to the professional audience without insulting, I think it works really well. If you have somebody who's too zealous, it doesn't work. So there's lots of opportunity, but it's an education on our part to figure out how we best use them.
No, absolutely. This is a preoccupation of Larry Chu at Stanford, and next year, I think at Medicine X, that he's invoking Medicine X Ed, where they're really trying to bring the patient voice even into undergraduate medical education. And it's a challenge because we're so used to not having the patient voice, and yet it's so valuable.
In that particular discussion, I asked the educators, did it constrain your conversation that the patient and the patient's mother were there? And universally, they said, yeah. They didn't feel as comfortable talking about issues with the patient being present in front of them, and even in just planning. So it was.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got to get over that.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Eugene, there's a question for you.
Hey, Lawrence.
Yes?
Sorry to interrupt. I'm going to flip up a slide or two here. We were at 9:50, so you got 5 minutes, and there's a hard stop. I want to make sure I get these up, and then you go with your question, and we can go till the very end.
I may cry.
It'll take me 2 seconds. Okay, first one is, we do have a very quick survey. We'd love for people to take, it's 5 questions. It'll take you 30 seconds. We're just trying to get a better idea of how many people are actually watching the different sessions on CME Palooza. There's a link right above where you're currently watching this, so it's really easy to take. It's just a SurveyMonkey. And then the last thing is, once this session ends, and it will end at 9:55, the next session will be exactly where you're watching. You just have to refresh your screen, and it'll start right at the top of the hour at 10 a.m. And that's it for me. So Lawrence, go ahead.
Eugene, there's a question that comes up very often. What's the value of credits and accreditation in the ex-US world?
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And I've got 3.5 minutes now.
9:55, so we're done.
Right. I think it's maybe similar to the US, where credits are used for slightly different purposes depending on which state you're in, or maybe by specialty, whether you use it for revalidation, relicensing, for your employer as proof of, in Europe, certainly outside of the, let's say, ex-US, sometimes the value of the credit actually is something as simple as evidence for the tax authorities, so your expenses are tax deductible. But the way things are going, and certainly over the past 10 years, there is much more emphasis now on the on a mandatory approach to, no, it's not much of an emphasis, sorry, it's mandatory, voluntary use of CME as supporting the individual healthcare professionals to demonstrate they're keeping up to date. I'm trying to avoid saying, their systems or they must do it, but there is that general trend. And we see it across Europe and also globally. Next week there's the meeting in India where they're talking about how to set up a national system and actually have the recognition of credits across states as well. The individual states of the country, into a harmonized system. Now the value is going up, but sometimes it's not just the CME per se. It's a demonstration. You collect your 50 points a year, but of course it's everything that goes on around that. The point of care education, the interaction with colleagues that isn't notched up, which is equally important, that should be also fostered.
Excellent. I think we have a great final question from our friend Brian McGowan, who, by the way, says we have to stop saying one thing and then doing something different. The community is full of talkers but lacking walkers. I agree. He asks, Kathy, can IPE delivered outside the team environment within a team IPE is very different than in a hotel CE?
Can IPE be delivered outside the practice environment? Was that the question? Or?
Well, I think that's what he's getting at. So it says, so you do team-based teaching in a place where the team works,
right.
rather than doing it in a hotel.
Right. So I think there are a tremendous amount of challenges, and Brian and I have talked about this, in relation to bringing teams together, particularly in the healthcare setting where the team is in such flux. Every shift that a nurse has changed, the team can change. So there are going to be strategies that are more effective when you can keep those same team members together and work with that team over time. But I would also argue that there's value in teaching team-based skills to individual practitioners, even if they return back to their practice setting, just more informed or more capable of using those team-based skills that they learned outside of the practice environment.
And I agree with you, Kathy. I have seen it work, but it takes work on the side of the provider to get people who don't typically work together to try to learn together, because there are barriers that exist because they don't practice in the same place at the same time. Derek, my clock says 9:55.
As does mine.
So I would love to thank Brian. Thanks for sticking in until the end. Eugene, thank you so much. Safe travels to India. I think you're going very soon. Kathy, thank you. And Derek, thank you, and Scott again for the opportunity.
Sure,
Thank you,
and
guys.
thanks all of you so much for joining us. To all of you watching, stay tuned. 5 minutes. The next session will be up, and we'll be at it again. Thank you all.
Sounds good. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.